You open up the New Testament and boom, right there at the very beginning, the Gospel of Matthew. Have you ever stopped to wonder, why that specific book is first? Well, in today's Explainer, we're diving into some absolutely fascinating research by Mark Bates. We're going to uncover exactly how this gospel acts as the ultimate architectural bridge connecting the Old and New Testaments. And spoiler alert, it manages to do this without invalidating the Hebrew Scriptures or somehow replacing those original covenant promises.
In this explainer, we're laying out the blueprint for this bridge by looking at 5 key structural components: the premier canonical bridge, authorship and historical crisis, the Pentateuchal scaffolding, the Immanuel bookends, and finally, fulfilling the law.
All right, let's jump straight into part 1, the premier canonical bridge.
So Matthew wasn't just slapped at the front of the line by accident, or just because of when it was written. Early Christians absolutely prize this book because it is so highly structured and honestly incredibly practical. Think of it kind of like an onboarding manual or a survival guide for the early church. Really early documents, like the Didache, drew heavily on Matthew. They weren't just reading it as a good story, they used it as a primary catechetical directory, a moral handbook, and even a liturgical manual. It literally gave the early church the exact step-by-step framework they needed for global discipleship, complete with how-to instructions for baptism and the Lord's Prayer. And this setup perfectly illustrates what theologian Walter C. Kaiser Jr. calls the promised plan of God. Basically, Matthew acts as this ultimate bridge because it proves, without a doubt, that Jesus is the grand climax of one continuously unfolding divine plan. We can trace this whole thing starting from the seed promised in Genesis 3:15, flowing right through the Abrahamic, Sinaitic, and Davidic covenants all the way to the New Covenant in Jesus the Messiah. By showing this organic, continuous timeline, Matthew completely avoids the theological trap of supersessionism. That's the idea that the church just swooped in, replaced ethnic Israel, and canceled God's original promises. Not at all. Instead, Matthew shows God expanding his single, unified plan.
Moving right along to our second component: authorship and historical crisis.
Now, to really appreciate what Matthew is doing here, we have to talk about a sort of historical paradox with this text. There's an early church father named Papias, and he noted that Matthew originally compiled his teachings in a Hebrew dialect. But, and here's the catch, the Gospel of Matthew we actually have today is written in highly fluent Greek. So what's going on? Well, scholars believe this points to a really deep Semitic root and a Hebraic rhetorical style that completely underlies the Greek text. It affirms the text's strong apostolic heritage coming directly from Matthew, the tax collector turned apostle, making it a text that perfectly bridges the Jewish and Greco-Roman worlds. But why put all this together the way he did? The answer largely hinges on the year 70 CE. And let me tell you, this was a massive, catastrophic year in Jewish history. The Roman legions literally destroyed the Jerusalem temple. Just imagine the trauma of that. In the immediate aftermath, this intense, fierce debate exploded among rival Jewish factions over who truly represented the faithful remnant of Israel. Non-Messianic groups started pointing fingers, claiming the destruction was God's judgment brought on by lawless heretics.
So, here's the crucial takeaway. Matthew actually wrote his gospel, in part, as a direct, apologetic defense. He had to prove to these critics that Messianic Jesus followers weren't just a bunch of lawless defectors who abandoned the Torah. Actually, it was the exact opposite. He specifically structured his gospel to show that followers of Jesus were the true guardians of covenantal fidelity. They were the ones upholding God's unfolding promise plan.
Okay, that brings us to part 3, the Pentateuchal scaffolding. Check this out. Matthew intentionally built his gospel around 5 major teaching discourses, deliberately mirroring the 5 books of the Mosaic Torah. He's constantly presenting Jesus as the greater Moses through these rapid-fire reverse Exodus parallels. It's brilliant. Pharaoh's slaughter of infants, mirrored by Herod's massacre. Moses fleeing to Egypt, mirrored by Jesus' family seeking refuge there. Israel passing through the Red Sea is mirrored when Jesus is baptized in the Jordan River. Israel totally fails during their 40 years of wilderness wandering, right? But Jesus perfectly succeeds during his 40 days of wilderness temptation. And finally, Moses goes up Mount Sinai to receive the law, while Jesus goes up a mountain to deliver the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus succeeds in absolute, perfect covenant obedience exactly where the wilderness generation failed. Now, as brilliant as this 5-part scaffolding is for equipping the church, we do have to be a little careful here. Scholars like D.A. Carson and Douglas Moo hit the nail on the head when they remind us not to treat the cross and the empty tomb as just some tacked-on epilogue. Yes, the 5 discourses are the instructional scaffolding, absolutely, but the passion and resurrection remain the ultimate redemptive climax. Think of it this way. The instructions show us how to live, but the passion and resurrection provide the actual redemptive power that makes living it out even possible for us today.
Next up, our fourth component, the Immanuel Bookends.
Matthew uses this really clever literary device called a chiastic inclusion. I know, a fancy academic phrase, but basically it just means he uses bookends to lock the whole narrative together. Watch this. The gospel opens in Matthew 1:23 with the profound promise of Immanuel, which literally means God with us. And then it closes in Matthew 28:20 with Jesus boldly declaring, "I am with you always to the end of the age." This isn't just a nice callback. It proves a central radical claim. Jesus isn't just a really smart teacher. He is the persistent, unmediated presence of Yahweh dwelling right among his people. He is the true temple.
And who exactly gets to experience this amazing divine presence? Well, just look at the opening genealogy. In the ancient world, it was super rare to include women in these standard patriarchal family trees. So Matthew's choice to feature 4 very specific women is incredibly surprising. We've got Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. And what's the common thread here? They all have profound Gentile, non-Israelite connections. Matthew is signaling right out of the gate in chapter 1 that God's promise plan always intended to expand the blessing of Abraham to all the families of the earth.
And this sets up just a beautiful trajectory for Jesus' entire mission. You see, his earthly ministry was initially restricted strictly to Israel, but following his sacrificial death and vindicating resurrection, the doors are blown wide open with the Great Commission to all nations. And this is key. This wasn't some plan B just because Israel rejected him. No, in first-century Jewish thought, the gathering of the Gentile nations was the expected, prophesied result of Israel's messianic redemption. It preserves Israel's original promises while seamlessly expanding that covenant globally.
And finally, we arrive at our fifth and final structural piece, fulfilling the law.
Okay, so remember those accusations from rival factions we talked about earlier, that Jesus' followers were just lawless defectors? Jesus takes this head-on in Matthew 5:17, when he explicitly says he did not come to abolish the law. The Greek word used there is Kataluo, and it literally means to tear down, disintegrate, or invalidate. Think of taking a giant wrecking ball to a physical building. Jesus strongly repudiates this idea. He is absolutely not a lawless innovator showing up to dismantle the Mosaic covenant.
Instead, what Jesus actually says is that he came to fulfill the law. The Greek word here is Pleroo. Now don't just think of this as checking off a prophetic prediction on a to-do list. No way. In the ancient Hebraic mind, it means to fill something full. It means bringing an Old Testament pattern, institution, or command to its absolute intended height and its ultimate eschatological culmination. This right here is exactly how Matthew perfectly bridges the two testaments. He doesn't just erase the old, he shows Jesus bringing its deepest patterns to their absolute intended peak.
Let's actually look at a practical example of this Pleroo playing out in real life during the Sermon on the Mount. Scholars Gushi and Stassen point out that Jesus uses this really cool triadic structure. Basically, he takes a traditional command, diagnoses the underlying sinful pattern, and then prescribes a transforming initiative. For instance, the traditional command is, "You shall not murder," but the sinful pattern behind it? That's nursing anger, harboring contempt, and throwing verbal insults. So what's the transforming initiative? Urgent reconciliation. Drop what you're doing and go make peace with your brother immediately. Do you see what he's doing? Jesus doesn't discard the Old Testament command. He completely transforms it from the inside out to enable genuine human flourishing, which totally changes how we should handle our own conflicts today.
And honestly, this just brilliantly illustrates the ultimate goal here. This kind of exceeding righteousness isn't achieved by just piling on more external legalistic rituals. It is entirely achieved by internal heart transformation. Jesus is fulfilling those incredible new covenant promises we find in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, literally writing the Torah directly upon the hearts of his people through his indwelling spirit. The law isn't dead, it's finally alive inside the believer.
Which brings us to a final, really crucial thought. Matthew constructs an absolute masterpiece of biblical theology here. It's a true canonical bridge seamlessly connecting the two testaments, linking the grand redemptive narrative of the Hebrew Scriptures straight into the eschatological reality of the New Covenant. So if Matthew so brilliantly bridges these covenants, without destroying them, completely avoiding supersessionism, how does this fundamentally reshape your understanding of early Christianity's profound connection to its Jewish roots? It's a powerful question to chew on, and it completely changes how we read this foundational text. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.